Welcome back to the shop, everybody. In today's episode, we're going to be working with a franchise that has had a significant impact on my life, the Rocketeer. Now, this was the first movie I ever saw in the theater and inspired my love of rockets. It's one of the first costumes I ever wore, with my dad making the helmet in 1991. The rocket pack is actually the first project I ever 3D modeled and 3D printed. And last year, my fiance and I not only spent our first Valentine's Day, but our first convention together as Cliff and Jenny from the movie. While the rocket pack gets most of the attention, the helmet is a super fun project which demonstrates how to put together a 3D print, vacuum form, and a fun little trick to get a metallic finish. So much so that today we're going to be rebuilding the helmet so that I can demonstrate to you how to build one for yourself. Let's start with the helmet. Both helmets seen here are printed in PLA Plus on my bamboo P1S from files created by GADGothenburg on Etsy. The only difference between the two is the helmet we are building in this video was scaled to 102.5%, so it doesn't press my nose as bad as the original did. Like most printed projects, the build starts by cleaning up the printed components to remove any flashing and support material left from the printing process. In particular, these parts were printed with a brim, and we need to make sure any trace of it is removed to ensure the pieces fit together properly. This should go without saying, but always test fit your pieces before you apply any glue. Once everything is sanded, we are going to glue the pieces of the helmet together using super glue with accelerator. As a recap from the Ghost Palisman video, accelerator is applied to one surface, glue is applied to the other, and then the parts are brought together, and in a few seconds, the glue will create a permanent bond. For the Rocketeer helmet, I started with the faceplate, then continued to build up the center and finally attach the sides. At this point, I recommend you try the helmet on to ensure you are happy with the fit before moving on to the next steps. With the helmet glued together, we need to start filling the seams. In particular, the large seam on the cheek rib. For this application, I am going to use Epoxy Sculpt epoxy putty. Not only is this compound useful to fill seams and prevent them from showing up later, the adhesive nature will provide some additional strength to the joints, especially the large cheek seams. Equal parts A and B are kneaded together and then applied to all the seams. The helmet is then allowed to cure for 24 hours to allow the putty to harden. With the putty cured, the wet sanding equipment is brought out, and starting with 120 grit, the putty is brought down even with the surface. Generally, I like to keep 120 the lowest grit to prevent damage to the printed components, but for areas where you need to reshape the putty, you can use 80 grit. Just be aware you'll likely have scratches that will need to be addressed later. At this stage, you want to sand until you have something that looks like this, where the seams are relatively smooth, there are no large gaps, and some of the print lines have started to disappear. Although the seams are filled, they are still raised compared to the rest of the helmet's surface because the epoxy and PLA have different hardnesses and sand differently. No amount of sanding or glazing putty is going to fully remove the raised seams, so we need to blend them into the helmet with body filler compound. The compound is applied in such a way that the seam is basically buried under it, while the compound blends into the natural curves of the helmet. With the compound cured, the helmet is sanded, and we are at the filler primer stage. As always, take your time and put some thought into how you will support your prop during painting, and don't be afraid to make something if you have to. On this project, I used some scrap plywood and 2x4 to make a stand that will allow me to paint the entire helmet, including the bottom lip. With the stand sorted out, the helmet received its first 3 coats of filler primer to start filling in the print lines and help me see what areas I still need to address. With everything a uniform color, low points are addressed with glazing putty and/or Bondo, and everything is sanded again. At this point, you will repeat the cycle of filler primer, filling, and sanding until you are happy with the finish on the helmet. Now that the helmet is nice and smooth, we've sanded it to the 320 grit level, let's go ahead and focus on the fin. The fin, like the helmet, is printed in PLA Plus at 102.5 scale. I printed all the pieces with the largest flat surface on the bed, but because of the taper on the fin, the rear part is likely going to have issues on the bed side, which is fine because we have to do a lot of body work on this part anyway. Assembly of the fin starts by removing any support material and sanding everything to remove any residue from adhesives used to hold the print to the print bed. After a test fit, all the mating surfaces are covered with a layer of 30-minute epoxy, and then the whole fin is sandwiched between wax paper and two boards with weights to ensure everything cures straight. Once the epoxy is cured, the fin is sanded to remove the excess epoxy, and then filler compound is applied to even out the surfaces. Since there is no good holding point, you will need to work one side at a time, so here I apply the Bondo and let it cure, sand, and then repeat on the other side of the fin. With all the body filler and power sanding, most of the defects have been removed. Before filler primer, I went ahead and addressed some visible issues with spot glazing putty, wet sanded the fin, and then applied 3 coats of filler primer. Like the Bondo, the filler primer needs to be applied one side at a time, so I applied 3 coats in the evening and then 3 coats in the morning before going to work, where I accidentally captured sunrise at my house. With both sides cured, the fin is wet sanded and then inspected for defects. Ideally, we want it as smooth as possible before it is joined with the helmet. Once the fin and helmet are smooth enough to paint on their own, we can join the two parts together. First, test fit the two parts, sanding the slot on the helmet as necessary until we know they will fit together. I then add masking tape to the fin to provide a sanding guide and protect the areas that don't need to see 80 grit sandpaper. The bonding surfaces are sanded with the rough grit sandpaper until the plastic is visible again. Then 30-minute epoxy is applied to the helmet and the two parts are joined and the assembly is allowed to fully cure. Once the epoxy has cured, any gaps between the fin and the helmet are addressed with epoxy sculpt and glazing putty, then sanded back to a smooth finish. Once the fin is attached, we no longer want to use filler primer, so the helmet is given 3 coats of black primer to allow a final check of the finish with a uniform color. 2 days after the primer is applied, any small defects are treated with glazing putty, and the entire helmet is wet sanded one more time down to 400 grit. Before we apply the final paint, we need to add the rivets around the eyes. For my build, I purchased some 1/8 inch brass rivets from McMaster. The shortest length is still longer than the thickness of the helmet, so I cut the heads off 8 rivets, leaving just enough to bond into the holes on the helmet without going all the way through. The holes on the helmet are then cleaned out with an 1/8 inch drill bit, and the rivets are finally bonded in with super glue. Once the glue is dry, the helmet is wiped down with a damp microfiber towel, allowed to dry, and then the entire helmet is painted with 2 coats of black primer, followed by 2 to 3 coats of Rust-Oleum metallic champagne bronze paint. Since we want to keep the luster, we do not use a clear coat and allow the helmet to fully cure for a week before polishing and weathering. While we let the paint cure, let's tackle the lenses. The file set includes 2-piece negative molds for producing a plaster buck for vacuum forming. As the other parts on this build, I printed everything in PLA Plus at 102.5% scale. Keep in mind when printing these components, orientation is critical to ensure everything fits together and you don't get weird layer lines in the lenses. Before we pour plaster, we want to smooth the surfaces as much as possible, so we apply filler primer to the mold surfaces, wet sand, and then repeat as needed until the surface that will form the lens is glass smooth. Once the surface finish is ready, the molds are assembled and taped together in such a way that if the plaster leaks, it won't spill all over the table. Then the seam between the two parts of the mold are filled with modeling clay to create a watertight seal. Use a wooden stick to ensure the clay is packed into the seam and that the seam is sharp and clean. After wiping away excess clay from the lens surfaces, it's time to fill the molds with plaster. In my case, I used Ultra Cal 30 gypsum cement that I've had in my garage for years, but I believe this should also work with plaster of Paris. Mix a compound per the manufacturer's instructions, pour into the mold, and allow to cure. You'll notice I didn't fill the molds completely. This is because I ran out of material, but I found out filling the molds halfway actually helps with the removal of the buck and fitting both lenses on a 12-inch by 12-inch sheet of plastic. Once the plaster has cured, the tape is removed, the parts of the mold are separated, and the buck is removed by putting a little bit of pressure on it. Again, make sure you do not completely fill the mold so you have some leverage to press the buck out of it. Once both bucks are removed, we're ready to focus on vacuum forming. I will shoot a full video on vacuum forming in the future, but for now we're going to just cover the basics related to this build. Since the lenses are pulled from a single piece of 12-inch by 12-inch PETG, we're going to use my small vacuum forming setup consisting of an MDF platen with ABS printed components that connect to a shop vacuum for suction. The plastic is prepared by removing the protective film, then securing the piece into an aluminum frame with binder clips. The plastic is then heated using the large protoformer in my shop until it becomes soft and droopy around 260 degrees Fahrenheit. I realize this is not a tool most people will have access to, but I hope to demonstrate a more garage-friendly heating system in the future. Once the plastic has drooped about an inch from the frame, it is removed from the heater, then pressed on top of the bucks while the shop vac pulls all the air out, forcing the plastic to conform to the bucks. Once the plastic has cooled for a few minutes, it is removed from the frame, the bucks are popped out, and we have plastic lenses that perfectly conform to the helmet. The lenses are tinted using a method I learned from a Punished Props video, which you'll find in the description. In a nutshell, I brought a pot of water and iDye Poly Black to 145 degrees Fahrenheit, then submerged the lenses in the mixture for 10 minutes, followed by a quench in clean water and a rinse. This provides a sunglass-like tint that I can see out of very well. Once dyed, the excess material is trimmed away with a Dremel and a plastic saw, and then the lenses are cleaned with Windex, and then they are finally ready to install in the helmet. Returning to the helmet, the paint has cured, and while the color is good, the paint by itself looks dull. To make it look like actual metal, we'll use a trick I learned from some Rocketeer builds on the replica prop forum and polish the helmet with stove polish. There is a bit of a learning curve here, so practice on some scrap material, but the overall process is apply the polish to a soft polishing cloth and rub into the helmet until the desired appearance is reached. Biggest piece of advice I can offer is take your time. It took about half an hour for me to change the helmet from dull paint to polished brass. We've now reached the final stretch of the build. The lenses are installed with hot glue, alternating screen mesh is installed over the mouth vent to hide my lips while allowing me to breathe, again with hot glue, and I add a liner I purchased from Valor Replicas with Velcro to the helmet. As a final touch, I added a custom nose guard to prevent the printed material from rubbing on my nose. With everything installed, the helmet is complete and ready to be part of the costume. This was a fun project for me because of all the different techniques involved, and I hope this video gives you the inspiration to try to make one of these for yourself. Big shout out to GADGothenburg for producing the amazing files, and big thank you to Bill Duran at Punished Props for the excellent tutorial how to dye the lenses. If you have questions or suggestions for future builds, let me know in the comments below. Good luck with your builds, and I'll see you in the next video.